How's everybody doing?
Good, how are you?
So for some reason, it doesn't let me record on the cloud anymore, but I've managed to upload recordings to YouTube and post links to the YouTube recording or the YouTube broadcast of the recordings to your Moodle page in case you want to see any of them. So I'll keep doing it that way. It does take a little bit longer on my end. YouTube has to do some sort of, I don't know if it's compression or they have to do something to the file before you can upload it. And that seems to take like a half hour for some reason. But that's all right. As long as it works, that's fine. So I was noticing that your put a bunch of grades in yesterday. Your course averages are still crazy, right? They're still up to like 1,000, and I don't understand it. So I emailed my contact at the university again today at the college to ask what I can do differently in my grade book because the way I have it set up, I can't see what I've done wrong. It looks like, for example, all the homework grades that are in there and look normal. They're between 0 and 100. And then there's a column that says homework average. And it says just taking the simple mean of the homework grades. And the averages are like 1,000, even though none of the grades are over 100. So I don't understand what I'm doing wrong. But evidently I am doing something wrong. So the bottom line is your grades are in there. Grades on the exams are in there. Grades on the homeworks and the quizzes are in there. They're just the averages aren't necessarily correct, but you can see the individual grades. Okay. Do you guys have any questions before we go on with stuff from today?
I just have a question about the grades. I just checked mine, and for the exam, my points are in, but the percentage says 0.
That's not good. The exam, the same thing as the last exam was out of 60, and I could only get it to post points. So a lot of people got in the 50s out of 60, which is a pretty good grade. So the best I can tell you is to do the calculation, put whatever you got over 60. Now, in my view, there is a column that says exam total, and it has the first and second exams in there, and that actually is a percentage in my view. I don't know if it
Yeah,
is on the student view.
yeah, I have the exam total, and right now it's like 67% because the first one I got 100, and the second one it's saying I got 0%, even though the points are in.
Well, that's not good. All right, I'll look at that. Let me write that down to figure out what's going on. Sorry about this, guys. I don't know what's going on. Anybody else having issues like that?
I noticed that only, I think one of my my lab scores are in there and the other ones are still not showing up.
The lab scores.
Yeah,
Only one lab score.
they're saying empty.
All right, I'll keep working on it. Anything else? All right, so today we start with the skeletal system. So this is where the semester gets kind of crazy and really involved. And there is a lot in this chapter. If you guys got a chance to look through the PowerPoint for this week, for today and tomorrow, there's a lot there. One of the first things that I want to do with you is share my screen and go to Pearson, because there's a whole study area in Pearson, and I think many of you probably aren't even aware that it's there, but it can really help out a lot when you're studying these upcoming chapters. So let me share my screen. So in Pearson, If I go to Pearson and I go to your course, this is what I see. I don't know exactly what you see because, again, I don't have a student preview in this for some reason. But one of the items on the left here is something called study area. And you have that as well. I just don't know if you have all of these things. If you hit study area, there are a lot of really cool study resources. So Pearson is so much more than just the e-text. There are practice tests and quizzes for every chapter. There are animations and videos for every chapter. There's something called interactive physiology, which is cool when you get to things like why does the red blood cell bind to oxygen, that kind of stuff. There are lab videos. What I want to use a lot of is this Practice Anatomy Lab, PAL, and the PAL flashcards. PhysioX is really cool too. There's a lot of physiology stuff in here. Now, most of what we're doing today, and with this chapter, the skeletal system, is anatomy. We don't do a lot of physiology with the skeletal system. But like I said, when you get to things like the blood, or even like the urinary system or the respiratory system, you might find some of these physiology tools better. Now, just for an example, I'm going to go to Practice Anatomy Lab, PAL. And it brings me to this page, and I just launched that page. Now, here are all my options, right? I can look at things with a cadaver. So from the view of a cadaver, I could look at anatomical models. I could do histology, which, there's a little bit of histology with each of these systems. And then you could go into the cat or the fetal pig as well. So for this chapter, I'm going to pick anatomical models. And you can see that it's broken down by the different systems. Now, today and this week, we're going to talk about the axial and appendicular skeleton. We'll go on to do muscular and so forth. So if I just click axial skeleton, then it gives me even more choices. The skull, the vertebral column, the thoracic cage. I'll pick the skull. I'm just picking the first one. So now I get to this view of the skull. Right, I can select a structure or label to hear a pronunciation. So I can click on it. Can you guys hear that or no? Maybe not. But I can click on any bone and they actually pronounce it for you. So something like sphenoid. Okay. Within this, there's the self-review. So for this particular self-review, there's 35 different slides that you can go through and name the bones of the skull. And then there's a quiz that you can take. Again, this doesn't count for anything, but it's a good study tool. And then there's a lab practical. The lab practical is even more helpful in a lot of ways because you actually have to enter in the term, right? It doesn't give you a multiple choice. You have to enter that in. And so that's just one example. That's just the PAL and the anatomical models. Okay, so if I go back to PAL, again, I got to anatomical models. You can go up to the human cadaver and you could choose the same sorts of things, right? And it's going to be the same thing on a human cadaver as it is on an anatomical model. But when you get to things like the muscular system, it's going to look different. Obviously, a cadaver looks different. So there's all these different things that you can study from, right? Plus, I'm going to go back even more. Go back to this. No, never mind, that's not what I want to do. If I go to the study area again, so that's all under the study area. That's all under Practice Anatomy Lab, PAL. There are also PAL flashcards, which are really helpful as well, right? You can do them again from these different choices, the cadaver, the models, histology. So let's pick anatomical models, right? And you can go on to select different parts of the skeleton. We'll try the skull again. And you can even select the structures you want to study, right? So there's going to be more structures here than what we're studying. So you could narrow it down. You could pick, 25 things that are what we've talked about in class. Maybe we didn't talk about mandibular angle, but the mandible. Maybe we didn't talk about the lesser wing of the sphenoid or the lateral horn, but we talked about the lamboid suture or the lacrimal groove, right? So you can check just the ones you want, and you can review them, right, on the flashcards. And then you can all the flashcards that you can repeat the deck, or you can take a quiz on them. So there's all different study tools in here, right? And I want to make sure that you guys are aware that all these tools are here. They're going to be really useful for some of the things going forward. Like I said, with the things like the bones, the muscles, the nerves, that kind of thing. In addition to these, I think, there's coloring books are always a good thing. There are a lot of coloring books available on Amazon for like $12 that are really good for learning muscles and bones and stuff like that. So I just want to make you aware that all these things are available to you, right? Again, there's all kinds of animations in here. There's lab videos that show dissections. There's all different really cool things that are in here in the Pearson study area. So in addition to just Googling things and looking up things on YouTube, I think this is a really great tool to use. So I encourage you all to use it for more than just the quizzes and the homework questions. Right? So questions about that? So we can go to chapter 6, the skeletal system. So these slides are on your Moodle page. That's where I pulled them up from today. So we'll start by going through the skeletal system. The way that I do this is kind of the first half of the chapter. I talk about the structures, kind of the microscopic structures of bone and the cells that are of bone and all that sort of thing. And then the second half of the chapter is basically going through and naming bones and how we classify them. And so I anticipate that we will only get to part of the second part today. We'll only get to a little bit of that naming today, but that ties in really well with what we're going to do for lab. So I'm going through a lot of your Pearson content and seeing if there's some things that I can get through there that'll be good for you to use to label the bones and things like that for lab. So that's why I haven't posted a lab yet, but that's the kind of thing that I'm expecting to do tomorrow, to go through with you tomorrow. So, skeletal system. So the skeletal system is an organ system, right? So it's made up of multiple organs, and organs are made up of multiple tissues. So the skeletal system not only has bones, right, which we all think of, cartilage are part of the skeletal system, ligaments, which are really just connective tissues. And then at the end of this chapter, we'll go on to talk about joints. So pretty much, why do we study the skeletal system? What does it do for us? What are some of the things that it does for us?
It makes blood cells.
Good, it makes blood cells. Excellent. What else?
Support the body.
Supports the body.
A framework.
Framework, structure, framework for the body. What else does it allow us to do?
Move.
Move. Good. Now, it only allows us to move in conjunction with muscles. Right? If there's not a muscle attached to a bone, then it doesn't allow you to move anywhere. But if you attach a muscle to a bone, you can move. And that's where these joints come in. We'll talk about different types of joints. Some move and some don't. A joint is wherever two bones meet. It's called the joint. And some are movable, some are not. We'll get to that in a few minutes. So we started off talking about, functions of the skeletal system. You already said support, right? It does provide structural support for the body. Storage of minerals and lipids. It's a place that we store calcium and phosphorus. Okay, calcium becomes really important. We need calcium for muscles to contract. We need calcium to get nerve cells to communicate with each other. So calcium is really important. So support, storage of calcium. Blood cell production, River pointed that out correctly. That's where all our red blood cells are produced, in the center of our long bones. Protection. So nobody said protection yet, but think about something like your skull or your rib cage, right? Those are protecting organs. And then leverage, which is movement, right? Which Melissa said. When we pair up the bones with muscles, we can move. So those are kind of the primary functions of the skeletal system. Now, what we're going to get into is kind of bone tissue characteristics. So again, we're not naming the actual bones in the body yet. We're talking about what bone is actually made of. So which of the 4 types of tissue is bone? Does it fall into what category?
Supportive.
Well, which of the 4, so when we talked about all tissues can be grouped into 4 different categories, right? There were epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous. Which of those is?
Connective?
Connective, good. It's connective tissue. And if you remember connective tissue, the one characteristic that you could say about connective tissue is that the cells are kind of far apart, right? And there's a lot of matrix between them. And so in bone, it's the same thing. The bone cells are pretty far apart, and there's a lot of extracellular matrix between them. There's a lot of things between the bone cells that are not cellular. Most of the matrix is made up of calcium salts, mostly calcium phosphate, right, which is just a hard substance. It's a storage site for calcium. But also, it is made up of extracellular protein fibers. So we talked about collagen fibers, right? Connective tissue has collagen fibers in it. Collagen fibers are really strong. They give the bone a lot of its strength. And there are different classifications of the bones just based on their shape. So there's kind of just different groupings. There are long bones, short bones, flat bones, and irregular bones. And you can pretty much guess what a lot of these are, right? Long bones are longer than they are wide. So you think about bones of your arm or your leg or your fingers, right, or your toes. Short bones are about as wide as they are long. So you've got these little kind of round bones that make up your wrist and your ankles. Those are short bones. Flat bones are thin and relatively broad. So a lot of the bones of your skull are flat bones. And then irregular bones don't fit into any of those categories, right? Their shape is not like any of those others. So vertebrae are irregular bones. Features of a long bone. So I'm going to go to this. So here's a typical long bone, right? This is our humerus. This is our upper arm. First thing that I want to point out is that the middle of the bone, the shaft of the bone, is called the diaphysis. And each end, each of those kind of rounded parts at the ends are called epiphyses. So you have 2 epiphyses and a diaphysis, right? So whenever you're talking about bones, sometimes they talk about the diaphysis, which is the shaft of the long bone, or they talk about the epiphysis, which is the end of the long bone. At the center of the bone is a marrow cavity. What do you think is in the marrow cavity?
Bone marrow.
Bone marrow. What's red bone marrow do?
Creates blood cells.
Creates blood cells.
Blood-
Good.
Just red blood cells.
And is there another type of marrow in the marrow cavity? You guys know?
Yellow.
Yellow.
Yellow marrow.
Good. What is yellow marrow?
It's
Fat.
lipids.
It's fat. It's energy
Lipids.
storage. Yep. It's fat. So if you ever known somebody to like crack open a bone, like a chicken bone or something, and suck the marrow out, that's what they're getting, the fat out of it, right? The fat out of it is supposed to be very it's supposed to be a delicacy. So we've got the marrow cavity with the red and yellow marrow in the middle. Every bone is covered by a layer that protects it. It's called the periosteum. I always remember the prefix peri means surrounding, right? So surrounding the bone. I think of peri, I think of perimeter. Periosteum surrounds the bone. At the ends of every long bone are kind of these cartilage pads. So you can see, they call it articular cartilage. That's where the bone will articulate with another bone, right? There's going to be a pad there, and there's going to be a pad at the other end, just to prevent bones from grinding on bones, to prevent friction. There are lots of blood vessels in the bone that carry the nutrients to the cells. And then there's two types of bone tissue. There's compact bone and spongy bone. Compact bone is what you think of. It's the outer thickness. Like if a bone was a peanut M&M, the compact bone would be the candy shell, right? It surrounds the entire thing. And underneath that is spongy bone. Spongy bone would be the peanut, right? It's underneath it. So when you look at this diagram, the compact bone is really just this thickness that goes all the way around the outside of the bone. And this, the spongy bone is underneath that. So most of the spongy bone is at each of the ends, each of the epiphyses. And the reason for that is that there's compact bone here at the diaphysis, and then there's a big cavity where the bone marrow is, right? So there's not really much room for spongy bone. Most of the spongy bone is going to be in each end. And the only other, well, there's a couple other things on here. The endosteum, endo means within, so the inside of the bone is lined with the endosteum, so the inside of this marrow cavity is lined with a layer called the endosteum. Periosteum is on the outside, endosteum is on the inside. And the epiphyseal line we'll get to in a few minutes. That has more to do with bone development. So this just goes over in words what I said. Compact or spongy bone. Again, compact bone is relatively solid. It's the wall of the diaphysis, and it's kind of the shell all the way around the bone. Underneath that is spongy bone. It does line the marrow cavity, so there's a thin layer of it, but most of it is located in each epiphysis. When you look at bone under a microscope, this is what compact bone looks like. This is not what spongy bone looks like. This is what compact bone looks like. And what I'm going to do is skip ahead to this slide for a second. So if I were to cut through a long bone, the bone of the arm, let's say, right here, all the way on the right, this would be the outside. Right? This would be where the periosteum is. Then you have a thickness that is compact bone. So this entire thickness is compact bone. Inside of that is spongy bone. Right? To the left of this diagram, to the left of that spongy bone, that would be the cavity, bone marrow cavity. Right? And then there would be spongy bone, compact bone, and the other side of the bone. Okay, so we're just looking at the compact bone. We're just looking at the outer thickness, the candy shell. Compact bone is made up of all these little circular arrangements. Okay, everything is arranged in these nice tight little circles to make it more compact, to make it stronger. Each of these circular groups is called an osteon. So this right here is one osteon. Here's a second one. Here's a third one. It's the group of circles, right? It's not just one circle, it's a group of them. At the center of each osteon is a central canal. You can see it here. Okay. So what's in that central canal?
Arteries and veins.
Arteries and veins. What do arteries and veins carry?
Blood.
Blood. What's in the blood?
Oxygen and nutrients.
Oxygen and
Oxygen.
carbon dioxide, yeah, nutrients.
Good. Oxygen, carbon dioxide, glucose, all those things. Well, it turns out that, remember, bone is a connective tissue. The cells are far apart. These brown spots that you see, these like brown ovals that you see, those are the bone cells. Everything else between them is extracellular matrix. So you need to get oxygen to each of those cells, right? Why does each cell need oxygen?
Except for respiration.
For respiration, right? Every cell needs oxygen in order to make ATP, to make energy. So the only way to get that oxygen is through the blood, right? And then the blood travels throughout all these little tiny lines, these little lines that radiate out, okay, go to the different bone cells. And they bring oxygen, they bring blood to those bone cells, and they bring oxygen to those bone cells. Okay, so the osteon is the circular, the whole circular aspect. At the center of the osteon is the central canal, which sometimes is called the Haversian canal. I'm going to go back a couple slides. And in that is the blood vessel, right? When you're looking at this under a microscope, when I go back to that microscope slide, they're looking at just one osteon, one of these groups of circles. Don't get confused and think that this central canal is the bone marrow. The bone marrow is all the way over here, right? These are much smaller, right? This isn't a section through a whole bone. This is just through one osteon. You can see that the center of the bone, the center of that cavity is lined by the endosteum, right? That would be over here. Here are the trabeculae. There's that thin layer of spongy bone. And here you can see a perforating canal. That's a canal that's bringing blood to a different part of the bone, right? You can see that they're connecting the different central canals. The only other thing up here are the lamella. Each individual circle is called the lamellae. Okay, the group of circles is called an osteon. So I wanted to show you that before I went back to this one. So this is what you would see under a microscope. This whole thing here is one osteon. Okay, you can see very clearly the central canal. That's where the blood vessels are. You can see these dark spots. Those are the bone cells. Those black things in this picture, right? They were drawn as dark brown in that drawing. And you can see all the little canals that radiate out from the center to where these bone cells are. Those are called canaliculi, little canals. Okay, you can see the lamellae are the concentric circles. Here's one circle. Here's another, right? Here's another. The only thing I didn't mention are lacunae. Lacunae are like little caves. They're little hollowed out spots. So remember this tissue, this extracellular matrix, is really hard. It's very dense. And so you have these little hollowed out spots where the bone cells sit. So the dark spots here, the dark ovals, are really hollowed out spots, like little caves, called lacunae. And inside those lacunae is where the bone cells are. Okay, so each bone cell has its own lacuna, its own little cave. Okay, again, the functional unit is called the osteon, or sometimes called the Haversian system. Central canal is sometimes called the Haversian canal. That's only the structure of a typical compact bone. Spongy bone doesn't have any kind of structure like that. It's just these trabeculae, it's just these kind of wavy things. Okay. So compact bone, it does cover all of our bones, all of the bone surfaces, except inside the joint capsules, where we have articular cartilage over those. And we have these arrangements of osteons, these arrangements of circles to resist stress. Right? Spongy bone does not have osteons. They have lamellae, and they form rods or plates called trabeculae. They don't have a central canal. They do still have osteocytes. They do still have bone cells, which sit in little caves called lacunae. They're just not arranged in that nice tight circle. And spongy bone does have a lot of red marrow in it, in the spaces between those trabeculae where the red marrow is. And again, red marrow is where you produce blood cells. So spongy bone, where is it found? It's found underneath the compact bone in locations with stresses arriving from different directions. So usually, like I said, the epiphyses of long bones, the ends of the long bones, where the stresses are transferred across joints. It is much lighter than compact bone, which reduces the weight of the skeleton, makes it easier for us to move around, easier for the muscles to move the bones. So that's the microscopic arrangement of bone. Now, I said that these bone cells, they sit in little lacunae, right? And they go about their business. Well, there are 3 different types of bone cells: osteoblasts, osteocytes, osteoclasts. The prefix osteo tells you it has to do with the bone. Blasts are always immature cells. Anytime you see the ending blasts, they're usually young or immature cells. Cytes are mature. Clasts are like the opposite of osteoblasts. They break down material. So, with the 3 types of bone cells, osteocytes are the most abundant, right? The middle one there, those are the mature cells. They maintain bone structure. They're the ones that are, recycling calcium salts. When we are young, we have a lot of osteoblasts, and they're very active. Osteoblasts produce new bone through a process called ossification. So osteoblasts, are taking calcium from whatever you eat, right? If we eat things, or we have a lot of milk, or we have calcium supplements, we have that calcium in our blood. Osteoblasts can take that extra calcium and store it in our bones to make our bones stronger and to allow them to grow. Why it's really important for young children to have a lot of calcium. As we age, though, osteoblasts become less and less active, and osteoclasts become more active. Osteoclasts do the opposite thing. They actually can pull calcium from your bones to get it back into your bloodstream. So they are, through their activity, they're pulling calcium away from your bones, which in turn makes your bones more brittle, right? So when you're really young, osteoblasts are really active, and you're laying down new bone tissue because you're growing. And when you get to be in your 20s and 30s, the activity of blasts and clasts kind of even out. As you get to be older, osteoclasts start to win out, right? And they start to have a lot more, they are a lot more active. So they actually are pulling calcium from your bone. Think of it this way: if a 15-year-old kid falls down and breaks their arm, what do? They run to the doctor. What's the doctor going to do?
Put a cast on it.
Right? Put a cast on it. Because what's going to happen, they're going to line up the 2 ends that are broken and wait until those 2 ends grow back together. Right? They're going to wait for the osteoblast to lay down some new bone to grow those 2 ends together. Now, if you've ever known somebody that's had a cast at 15, how long does that take usually?
6 to 8 weeks.
Yeah, 6 weeks, something like that, right? Now, if you maybe, work at a nursing home, or you know anybody that's elderly, if they fall and break a bone and they're 75 years old or 80 years old, they put a cast on it and say, oh, in 6 weeks it'll be okay?
No.
No, right? That's because that person who's older has much more active osteoclasts and many fewer active osteoblasts. So they're fighting against that. They're fighting against those cells. They have more cells that are actually pulling calcium from their bones. They don't have a lot of cells that are laying new calcium down in their bones. Okay, so that's kind of always the way I think of osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Questions so far?
Is it that the osteoblasts are no longer there, or they just become less active?
They just become less active.
Okay, so they don't go away.
They don't go away. No, we still have them because you still can repair bone. It just takes a lot longer, right? The older you get, it just takes longer for that bone to repair.
All right, thanks.
All right. So then we get to, so we've talked about the structure of bone. We talked about the bone cells. Then we get to a thing called bone formation. Well, there's basically two different ways that bones start to form as we are an embryo. And those two ways are intramembranous ossification and endochondral ossification. Ossification is just bone formation, right? It ossifies, it becomes bone. If we look at those two words, endochondral, let's look at the second word first. Endo, what does endo mean?
Inwards?
Within, yeah, within, inwards. And what is C-H-O-N-D, chondral? What is that? What did I tell you? Chondra usually has to do.
Cartilage.
Good, cartilage. This type of bone formation, endochondral ossification, starts off as cartilage and becomes bone. So there are many bones that we have that when we were embryos, they were cartilage, right? And they ossified as we got older. And even most infants have a lot of cartilage, right? And that's those bones harden as they grow. The other type of bone formation is called intramembranous. This forms just within the membrane of a bone. So this first type, intramembranous, does not start off with cartilage, does not have a cartilage template. Right? The second type does start off as cartilage. So intramembranous ossification, this is the type that does not have a cartilage template. It occurs during fetal development around week 6. The osteoblasts differentiate from the connective tissue stem cells, and the blood vessels infiltrate the bone, and it just forms bone from connective tissue, right? A lot of the flat bones are formed this way. The bones of the skull, the mandible, they're formed this way. But many of our long bones start off as cartilage and ossify, right? Most of the bones of the skeleton actually form through endochondral ossification. So you have this cartilage template, right? You have this cartilage structure, and it turns to bone as you age. Now, this allows for these bones to get longer and longer over time, which is how you grow from an infant to an adult, right? Your arms, your legs, all those bones have to go through this process. So here is an example, right? This is a hyaline cartilage model. So you've got this cartilage, right? And this is, you're talking about in the embryo, there's this cartilage model. What happens here at the center of the diaphysis, you get what's called a primary ossification center. A lot of blood vessels are going to this area, bringing nutrients to this area, bringing calcium to this area. These cells, which when they're blue, they're cartilage, turn to bone. So they're turning from blue to tan, right? And from that center, they kind of spread out towards each end. So they go from the center of the diaphysis towards each epiphysis. Okay, and that center becomes bone, right? It started off as cartilage, it becomes bone, and more bone cells spread towards each end. Then the same thing happens in each epiphysis. In each epiphysis, you have what's called the secondary ossification center, where there's blood vessels that bring calcium, that turn these cartilage cells to bone. And these cartilage cells turn to bone, moving away from that secondary ossification center. Now, when you are completely done growing, the bone cells from the primary ossification center meet up with the bone cells from the secondary ossification center. And this whole thing is bone, right? At that point, your bone's not going to get any longer. That doesn't happen until you're like 18. What happens is you almost always have a plate or a line of cartilage right here between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. So what happens is you've got some cartilage right here, and those cartilage cells are dividing. So that area of cartilage gets thicker and thicker. And then some of it turns to bone, but then the cartilage gets thicker. And some of it turns to bone, but then the cartilage gets thicker. And in doing that, that's how you grow, right? The signals for that are from hormones. In doing that, that's how you grow from an infant to a child to an adult. That's how bones of your leg, bones of your arms grow longer. If you've ever gone to the doctor or brought your child to the doctor and heard about the doctor talking about their growth plates, that's what they're talking about. This epiphyseal cartilage right here, this epiphyseal line, which is what it was on one of the previous slides, is an area of cartilage. So everything above it is bone, everything below it is bone. But there's an area, there's a line of cartilage, or kind of a zone of cartilage. The bigger that zone is, the more room that child still has for growth, right? So sometimes you go to a doctor and the doctor says, well, their growth plates are still open, which means they might grow a few more inches, right? Maybe they're 13, 14 years old and they're still going to grow several more inches. Or the doctor might look and say, well, their growth plates are almost closed, so they're probably close to their full height, right? That's what they're talking about. It's how much cartilage is here. Is it just a line of cartilage? Is it more of a thick zone of cartilage? The thicker it is, the more chance there is that this person is going to grow taller, or that their bones will grow taller. So if you've ever heard about a growth plate, that's exactly what they're talking about. They're talking about this line of cartilage that's between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. And you have two at each long bone, right? You have one at each end. Anybody ever hear of that? Growth plates?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's what they're looking at. That's what doctors are looking at when they're estimating that.
I have a question about that.
Sure.
So when you're an adult and you're fully grown, is there still a line of cartilage there, or does it not exist anymore?
It's a really thin line. So you can still see it. You can still see where that growth plate is, but there's like next to none. There's next to, none cartilage or no cartilage there.
So, question. I work for an orthopedic office, and so they do like in the knees and the hips and shoulders and stuff, there's like, that cartilage is gone, and then the bones are grinding together.
Mm-hmm.
So is that the slate, the line that you're talking about? Is that what disappears, and then they wind up putting like injections in there to expand it so that there's not any more rubbing?
So are you talking about, you're talking about more like injuries, like a knee injury kind of thing?
Well, no, just like, I think that it's osteoarthritis, like when that cartilage between the bones completely is like disintegrated, mm-hmm. and the bones are just rubbing together.
So that at that point, they're talking about the articular cartilage. This cartilage at the end of the bone, I can't get my cursor to where I want it to go. This cartilage at the end of the bone would be like a cartilage pad where this bone meets the next bone. So mm-hmm. that's more of what you're talking about, where the two bones are rubbing together. The cartilage I'm talking about is within the bone, right? And it's just the more cartilage is there, the more room that there is for this bone to grow longer.
Okay, so two different cartilages. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so endochondral ossification, these are the steps of it. Right. Okay, and here's your epiphyseal line. At puberty, the bone growth accelerates due to an increased sex hormone production. So this is all controlled by hormones. So when you're young, growth hormone controls this. When we're young, we secrete a lot of growth hormone. As we age, we secrete hardly any. And then when you hit puberty, you secrete either testosterone or estrogen, and that accelerates this when you get that rush of either testosterone or estrogen when you hit puberty. that accelerates this bone growth. And then after a certain amount of time, after you hit puberty, that is the same thing that causes this bone growth to stop. Right? And so again, even x-rays, somebody had this question, even if you x-ray an adult bone, you can see an epiphyseal line. There's not really any cartilage there anymore, but you can see where the bone from the end met the bone from the middle, right? And there's always going to be a line there. So all of that is growing the bone lengthwise, right, to get taller. But there's also appositional growth. Appositional growth is growth in diameter of the bone, so the bones get wider, right? They get thicker. And that's usually in response to having to carry more weight, right? There's always some sort of a stress on the bone that can cause the osteoblasts to develop in the periosteum, on the outside of the bone, and they will start to produce more of that calcium matrix and make the bone get wider and wider. So here is an example of oppositional growth, right? So again, an infant's bones obviously are going to be less in diameter, narrower in diameter. And as you go from a child to a young adult to a full adult, those bone cells grow wider, or those, I should say, entire bones grow wider. You have osteoblasts on the outside that are putting down new bone to make the bone bigger and bigger. And you have osteoclasts on the inside that are kind of hollowing out that inside at the same time, right? So that you don't end up with this big, thick layer of compact bone. The timing of epiphyseal closure varies from bone to bone. Digits close early, so fingers and toes, whereas the arm, the leg, and the pelvis bones close later, obviously because it takes you a lot longer to grow. It can differ from person to person, differs from males to females because of sex hormones, usually later closure in males. Usually females hit their adult height at like 16, whereas males it might be 18 or 19. My daughter's in middle school and all the girls are taller than the boys in middle school. Requirements for bone growth, again, mineral supply, you need calcium, and you need vitamin D. Vitamin D3 is something you get from the sunlight, and then the liver and the kidney process it into something called calcitriol that stimulates calcium and phosphate absorption by the bone cells. So some UV radiation is good for you because you can actually manufacture some of this D3, even though your liver and your kidney need to process what you manufacture. Right? Obviously, that's a slippery slope because a lot of UV radiation is bad for you. It can lead to different cancers. Other requirements for bone growth, vitamin A, vitamin C, both of those support osteoblasts. So those are the cells that are laying down new bones. So you need vitamin A and vitamin C as supplements or as part of your diet, whatever you eat. Also, growth hormone plays a big role in it. Thyroid hormone, because your thyroid hormones control your metabolism, so that's controlling what you get from the foods you eat. Sex hormones, meaning estrogen or testosterone when you hit puberty. And then calcium balancing hormones, PTH and calcitonin. So the hormones we'll talk about with the endocrine system. Don't worry about these right now. Just understand that a lot of this bone growth is controlled by hormones, right? We'll talk. There'll be a whole chapter where you'll learn about what these hormones are, what they do, where they come from. So we've talked about what calcium or what compact bone looks like, what the different bone cells are. We've talked about how the different bones form. Skeleton is a calcium reserve, right? We said that one of the things that your skeleton does is it functions as a storage site, particularly for calcium. It is the most abundant mineral in the body. Most of it is in our skeleton. We need it in our blood. So in some of the upcoming systems that we'll talk about, you need calcium to contract muscles. Absolutely need calcium for that. And you absolutely need calcium to get a message from one neuron to the next. So it's really important to have calcium in your blood, and it's necessary for those processes. So it also becomes really important to be able to store the calcium, if you have excess calcium, to be able to store it in your bones, and to be able to equally be able to pull it from your bones when you need it, right, if you don't have enough in your blood. And so that's what these hormones down here do, is they help regulate, so parathyroid hormone and calcitonin, they help regulate how much calcium is in your blood, okay? Parathyroid hormone can pull calcium from your bones and bring it into your blood. Calcitonin does the opposite. It takes extra calcium from your blood and stores it in your bones. Naming a fracture, you guys might know a lot about this, or more about this than I do. A fracture obviously is a crack or a break in the bone. There are two broad categories. Fractures can be simple or compound. Simple means closed. It's completely internal. There's no break in the skin. You can only see it on an x-ray, so there's no bone, sticking out of your leg or anything like that. Open fractures are generally much worse. They are where the bone is projecting through the skin. They are much more dangerous, primarily because there's a huge risk of infection whenever you have an open wound like that. Whereas with a closed wound, they can, line up the ends and kind of hope that or not hope, but wait for them to heal themselves. And fractures oftentimes are also named by the nature or the location of the break. The steps to repair a fracture, you're going to rush blood to the area because the blood has all the nutrients that you need to repair it. Right? So a large blood clot forms at the area. And the cells of the periosteum and the endosteum migrate into the fracture area. Callus forms around the break, providing strength. And then osteoblasts go to work. So they just start replacing cartilage with bone, right? The bones they're just growing back together. And the spongy bone is eventually replaced by compact bone, which is much stronger. And it always leaves a thicker spot at the fracture site. If you've ever broken a bone and then you go and you get an x-ray from a doctor years later, they'll be able to tell easily that you've fractured the bone. And it's because your body so quickly rushes nutrients to that area and forms a callus to kind of protect that area while it's healing, that there's always going to be a little bit of an enlarged area right there where the two broken pieces healed together. All right. Osteopenia and aging. Again, bones become thinner and weaker. That's a normal part of aging. It's because osteoclasts have a lot of activity even as we age, whereas osteoblasts don't. They are much more active when we're young. And so osteoclasts are constantly pulling calcium out of our bones to get it back into our bloodstream because we need it. The only way that this can be prevented that we know of so far is to make sure you take a lot of calcium as a young person. Right? If you take a lot of calcium as a child and as a young adult even, what happens is that extra calcium all gets stored in your bones. So if you eat a lot of foods with calcium and you take calcium supplements, then your bones have a lot more calcium in them. So it doesn't change the fact that osteoclast activity is really high when you're older, right? Much higher than osteoblast activity. All that changes is that there's a lot more calcium in your bones for those osteoclasts to pull, right? So it just takes longer for your bones to become brittle.
I have a question.
Sure.
The osteopenia and is that also affected genetics? Like I heard Asians are more prone to getting osteoporosis.
I don't know if that's necessarily true. I know there's a difference between men and women because of the hormones that we have in our bodies. Anytime you hear studies about a certain ethnic group or racial group or anything like that, I always worry there's just too many other factors involved.
Mainly.
Asians eat a completely different diet. right? They're on
Right.
a completely, so maybe the levels of calcium that an Asian person has doesn't equal what the level of calcium that a European or an American has. I don't know, so I always wonder about studies like that there's so many other things that could affect that.
All right. So the major thing is the diet, not the genetics.
I
Yeah.
think so, but I don't know that for sure. Don't quote me on that, but that's my understanding of it.
All right. I thank you.
You're welcome. Then we get to actually talking about the bones, right? So we've talked about all this microscopic stuff. And now we get to actually talking about the bones and the markings on the bones, and what do they look like, and what are the features, and all that kind of stuff. And so there are bone markings. There are specific features on the surface of bones, and they are landmarks. They tell you something about that bone. There are elevations, processes, and projections. They tend to be areas of the bone that kind of stick out a little bit, and they allow for a ligament or a tendon to attach. Usually where two bones articulate, where two bones meet, there will be parts that stick out that allow for ligaments to attach one bone to the next, or for tendons to attach the bone to a muscle. That almost always happens at joints. There are also depressions, grooves, and openings. There are places where blood vessels and nerves pass through the bone. So there's little tiny holes or little openings, or even just a little groove that a nerve can run through or run along. And they all have, there are some common names that we'll get to, but they all have somewhat unique names. So we get to the actual skeletal divisions. You guys have heard skeletal system consists of 206 bones. Are we born with 206 or more or less?
We're born with more.
We're born with more. Good. Why?
Because as we develop, some of the bones fuse together.
Good. As we grow, some of the bones fuse together. So we're born with more than 206. In order to make the skeleton easier to study, we divide it into axial and appendicular. Axial comes from the word axis. So where's the axis of your body?
The center?
The center, the middle. So all the bones that are along the center are part of the axial skeleton. The bones of your skull, your rib cage, so your sternum, your spinal column, all the bones along the center are your axial skeleton. Your appendicular skeleton, appendicular comes from the same word as appendage. So that's your arms and legs, right? Arms and legs, and what holds your arms and legs to your body, which are called the pectoral girdle and the pelvic girdle. So here is just kind of an overview of all the bones. You can see the axial bones are highlighted in yellow. The appendicular is just highlighted in kind of a clear color or a white color. So 206 sounds like a big number, right? But think about the fact that many of the bones we have both on the right side and the left side of our body, right? So that takes away a lot of the names right there. You just have a right and a left. A lot of them have very similar name or the same names just on one side or the other. So it's not really that many. It's not 206 different words that you have to know. So the axial skeleton is the center of the body. It has 80 bones. They are subdivided into the skull, the bones associated with the ear, okay, and the hyoid bone is kind of included in there. Then the bones of the thoracic cage and the bones of vertebral column. So in the skull, it's not just one big bone, it's actually 22 bones that we'll talk about. And then associated with the skull, we have 6 bones in our ears. We have 3 in each ear, 3 in our right ear and 3 in our left ear. They're tiny, they're about the size of a grain of rice. Okay, those are called ossicles. And then we have the hyoid bone. Anybody know where the hyoid bone is? you listen to any true crime stuff, you might know. So the hyoid bone is in your neck, kind of in front of, it's right where your voice box is, kind of in front of your trachea. It's the only bone that's not connected to another bone. It's just connected to tissue. And the reason I said you might recognize it from true crime or anything is that oftentimes if they find a body and the hyoid bone has been broken, they assume that the person's been strangled, right? Something has crushed that person's throat, because when that happens, when you're crushing somebody's throat, you'll break that bone right there. Okay, and then bones of the thoracic cage, those are going to be things like the rib and the sternum, the ribs and the sternum, we'll get to those. And the vertebral column, you guys know what the vertebral column is, the vertebrae. So, functions of the axial skeleton. Well, same things as the functions that we talked about of the skeleton in general. Support and protect organs, right? The brain, the spinal cord, the heart and the lungs are all protected by the axial skeleton. It provides a surface area for attachment of muscles. So most bones are attached to muscles, if not all of them. So muscles that can move your head and your neck and your trunk, muscles that can perform respiration, right? They move your chest cavity and allow it to expand and contract so that you can breathe. And stabilize elements of the appendicular skeleton. So we have muscles that are connected to our core, our center, that stabilize our arms and our legs. And then, of course, your skull houses your brain and your sense organs. We have a whole chapter that we'll get to that talks about, all the different senses, how eyes and ears and smell and all that stuff works, which is really amazing. And here is a figure of the adult skull, right? And each one of those different colors is a different bone. And so I'm going to go through some of these bones with you. So I'll start with, yes, that's as big as it can go. All right, so I'll start with the front, right? There are 8 cranial bones and 14 facial bones. Now, what do you think is the difference between cranial and facial?
Are facial bones connected to muscle?
Facial bones are usually connected to muscles and sensory tissue. Cranial bones are the bones that surround and protect your brain, right? So the facial bones are the ones in the front of our face that allow us to have different sensory organs and allow us to have a lot of muscle attachment. The bones of our cranium protect our brain. They surround and protect our brain. So when you talk about some of these bones, and I wish I had, let me just check one thing for, yes, it doesn't really do that. Okay, I'll go back to this. All right, so when we're looking at the face from the front, the first thing I want to point out is this big tan bone. It's called the frontal bone. That's our forehead. It's just one bone that goes all the way across. We don't have a right and a left. Okay, and what they're showing you in here, in a lot of these bones, they're showing you markers. For example, under the frontal bone, they list the supraorbital foramen. Now, a foramen or a foramen is a tiny little hole. So it's a hole for anything. It can be for a nerve, can be for blood vessels. And you can see that this hole right here is right above the eye. So that's why it gets the name supraorbital, right? It's above the eye. So that's what that foramen is, or that foramen. It's not one that I'm requiring you to know. I just, I want to point out what it is since it's on the slide. And I will create a list of the bones and the structures you need to know. because as I'm looking at this, well, as I'm looking at this, there are some more than what you need to know. Right behind the frontal bone is this pink bone called the parietal bone. You have two parietal bones. You have a right and a left, right and a left. And the seam is right down the middle. Now, wherever two bones meet, that's called a joint. The bones in the skull meet at joints that are called sutures, right? And they don't move. What is a suture, just in general?
Is a place of coming together.
Like
It's a place where they come together, but what do you, like
a stitch.
Yeah, stitches. So it looks like they've been sewn together. It looks like when you look at it, it's kind of this wavy line, like the two bones have been sewn together. So wherever two bones meet in the skull, you have a marking called the suture. And what they're showing up here are some of the sutures. The sagittal suture is right here at the top of the skull, and it runs the entire length of the parietal bone. Now, what's a sagittal section? What does that mean?
It would cut the body into left and right pieces.
Good, it cuts the body into left and right pieces. So this suture runs from the frontal bone all the way back to the occipital bone. It just splits the skull into right and left pieces, right? That's why it's called the sagittal suture. There's also a suture where the parietal bones meet the frontal bone, this curved line here. It's called the coronal suture. Anybody know what corona means in Spanish? Not beer.
Is it a
Crown.
crown?
Crown.
Crown.
Good. So that makes sense. This line up here is your crown, right? That's where the crown would be. We have, on the side of the skull, we have temporal bones. They're in this kind of dark pink color here. That's where your temples are, your temporal bones. You have a right and a left temporal bone. At the back of the skull, which they're not showing on this picture, they'll show on this one, is the occipital bone. Okay. So you can see here is the temporal bone meets up with the occipital bone at the back. That goes all the way across. So we've got one frontal, two parietal, two temporal, one occipital. That's 6. We have 2 more bones that are part of the cranium. We have the ethmoid and the sphenoid. Really hard to see these from a drawing because they hold the cranium, they hold the brain from underneath. So they're behind your facial bones. They're supporting underneath your brain, right? Just like holding your brain there. The ones that are on top and around the sides are easier to see. The ones that are up underneath are harder to see because you have facial bones in front of them, okay? So the first one, the bigger one here, is called the sphenoid bone. It's this purple one here. It's just one bone that goes all the way across. And you can see it behind the eyes. Now this is, obviously these are eye sockets, so this is, the eyes are removed, right? This is behind all the facial bones. And the other one that you can see, and you can barely see it in here, is the ethmoid. The ethmoid bone is in green here. It's kind of behind the nasal bones, behind the nose. You can see a little bit of it on the inside of each eye socket. You can see both of them better from underneath. Right, here is the sphenoid bone, this purple one, lavender purple. Looks like a butterfly to me from underneath. Goes all the way across. The ethmoid bone is up here, this green bone that's in here. It's, again, it's above, right? This is your upper jaw, the upper part of your mouth. It's behind your nose and above your jaw. It's holding your brain from the bottom. Okay. So the reason that it's really hard to locate the ethmoid and the sphenoid is because they're behind all the facial bones. Those are the cranial bones. So frontal, right and left parietal, right and left temporal, occipital, sphenoid, ethmoid. The others are all facial bones. They're there mostly for muscle attachment, nerve attachment, that sort of thing. They're easier to go through, right? We'll go through some of these. So this purple one here, it's your nasal bone, right? Nasal is your nose. So the very top of your nose is bone, even though most of your nose is cartilage. You do have a right and a left nasal bone. There's a line where they meet. There's a suture right there. Okay. Below the nasal bone, this kind of tan bone here, is the maxilla, right? That's your upper jaw. So it runs all the way from your nose down to where your teeth are. Your lower jaw, the part that moves, is your mandible. Right? And then you have your zygomatic bone, this bright blue one. That's your cheekbone. Above that, they've labeled the lacrimal bone. And if you look at that, it's right on the inside of your nose, right? Kind of in the inside of your eye socket, right by your nose. Lacrimal, does anybody know where the word lacrimal or lacrima comes from? What it means? Anybody? No? It's tears. It means tears. So your lacrimal bone is where your tear duct passes through. Okay, it's at the inside of your eye. And your palatine bone, which they're showing here, palatine bone is the roof of your mouth, right? You can see part of it, I guess, back behind the eyes if you look at it closely, but I'll show you this from underneath because the palatine bone is actually the roof of your mouth. What else do we have? We have the inferior nasal concha, these blue ones here. So when you inhale air, you've got these swirl-shaped bones, okay? And what happens is they move the air as it goes into your body. And by moving the air, it warms it up, it warms those particles up and allows you to have better gas exchange. So we have, they're called concha, they're these scroll shapes. You have inferior nasal concha, you have kind of middle ones or medial nasal concha, and you have superior ones. The middle ones are actually part of your ethmoid bone. But those little swirls in there are to allow air to move as you inhale it. All of those that we named are paired, except for the mandible and the max. Oh no, the maxilla is paired. You have a right and a left. Mandible is just one bone all the way across. The other one that's only one bone is called the vomer. This bone right here, it divides your nose in half. So it's not your septum, right? It's actually a bone behind your septum that divides your nose into right and left sides. And some of these are better viewed from underneath. So if we're looking at this from underneath and we take the lower jaw off, take the mandible off, you can see the maxilla, right? The upper jaw. And most of the roof of your mouth is maxilla, except for the part near the back of the roof of your mouth. That's your palatine bone. You do have a right and a left palatine bone. You can also see, your zygomatic bone, right? Your zygomatic bone is your cheekbone. Your temporal bone. You can see this big bone is the occipital bone on the back of your head. And this big opening is called the foramen magnum, which just is a big hole. What do you think goes through this hole?
Spinal cord.
Your spinal cord, good. Your spinal cord goes through that hole to meet up with your brain. On either side of that, you have these two condyles. That's where the condyles are where your skull sits on your first vertebrae. In your temporal bone, you have a hole called the external acoustic meatus. What do you think that is?
When I hear acoustics, I think of music, so I think of hearing.
Yep. The external acoustic meatus is your ear hole. That's all it is. It's a hole that leads to the internal structures of your ear. Okay, so some of these you see better from below, like especially the palatine bone, the sphenoid bone, right? The vomer, and even the occipital bone. Ah, all right. So sectional anatomy of the skull. So in this case, what they've done is they've taken the top off the skull. You're looking down into the skull with the top off of it. And they've color-coded the different bones. So you still have the frontal bone, that's your forehead, right? You still have your temporal bones on either side. Your parietal bones are going to be up above that. So your parietal bone is kind of up above where this cut is. The temporal bone's down here. And then in the back of the bone is your occipital bone. What you can see better, though, in this cut is the ethmoid and the sphenoid. Again, the one that's green is the ethmoid. The one that's purple is the sphenoid. Those are the two cranial bones that are holding your brain from below. So they're kind of behind all the facial bones. The sphenoid has this area called the sella turcica. Sella turcica is where your pituitary gland sits, which controls all your hormones. And the ethmoid bone has the cribriform plate and the crista galli. That is a lot of the sensory information from your nose comes in through there into your brain. So it's a bunch of little holes. Okay, but the biggest thing that I want you to get from this is where those two bones are. So again, bones of the face protect and support entrances to digestive and respiratory systems, attachment of muscles. The only bone of the face that's movable is the mandible, right? The rest of them are immovable. And then it just goes through the maxillary, the palatine, the vomer, the zygomatic, the nasal bones, the lacrimal bones, the nasal conchae, then the mandible. Now, are there any questions on the bones of the skull? I know there's a lot of them. I think those are the ones that are probably the most difficult in this chapter because they're the ones that we're all the least familiar with the names of going into this chapter. Remember, that's only part of the axial skeleton. The axial skeleton is made up of 80 bones, right? So those 24, whatever they are, 8 and 14, yeah, 22, are are only part of the 80. There is the hyoid bone. And here's a picture of a guy and showing where his hyoid bone would be. It is a small U-shaped bone. It's not attached to any other bone. It's only attached to soft tissues. It's a base associated for muscle, a base for muscles associated with your voice box, your tongue, and your throat. Your tongue is attached all the way back there, by the way, all the way down there. Supports and stabilizes the larynx, which is your voice box. Again, a lot of times if they find a body and this bone has been broken, they assume that the person has been strangled because however you strangle somebody, you're probably going to break that bone if you're trying to crush their windpipe. Then we get to the vertebral column, also called the spinal column. The bones are the vertebrae, the spine is the actual nervous tissue that runs through it. There are 26 bones that are part of the vertebral column. 24 of them are vertebrae. Okay, and then at the inferior end, you have the sacrum, and then at the most inferior end is your coccyx. So most of these are weight-bearing, so they provide a lot of places for muscle attachment, for support and protection. They also are protecting the spinal cord. And within the 24 bones that make up your vertebrae, there are 3 regions. We all have 3 regions. We all have the same number of bones in each of the 3 regions. And here they are. The 3 regions are cervical, thoracic, and lumbar. So cervical are the vertebrae of your neck. Thoracic are the vertebrae of kind of your upper to middle back. And lumbar is your lower back. Now, a couple of things. First of all, anybody have a good way of remembering how many cervical, how many thoracic, how many lumbar? So the way I was always taught was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You should eat breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 5. Right? That's what I always remembered, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So 7, 12, and 5. Whenever you hear about somebody injuring a vertebrae and it's got a letter and a number, you can now see what they mean, right? If you injured C4, well, that's cervical number 4. If you injured L2, that's lumbar number 2, right? So there's 24 bones right there that don't have individual names, just cervical 1, cervical 2, cervical 3, that kind of thing. Inferior to the lumbar region, below the lumbar region, is your sacral region, and the bone there is called the sacrum. It's just one bone. It was 5 vertebrae that have fused together to form one bone. It's right at the back of your hips. It actually attaches to both of your hip bones. You only count it as one bone. If you count it as 5, you end up with more than 206. And then the coccyx bone is your tailbone. Again, that's anywhere between 3 and 5 vertebrae that have fused together to form a tailbone. It hurts like hell if you break your tailbone because you can't do anything about it except wait. Everybody know that we have a tail when we're an embryo? All vertebrates have a tail. We have a tail and gills. Isn't that weird? We have, all vertebrates have gills too. So when you're an embryo, if you think about it, when you're an embryo and you're in your mother's womb, you're not breathing air, you're surrounded by liquid, right? You have gills that you use. And that becomes part of your inner ear when you're born.
I have a question about the cervical part.
Okay.
What does that prefix mean? Because when I hear cervical, I think of my cervix.
Good question. So I think, and this might just be in my own head, but I think cervical, meaning having to do with the neck, comes first. And the cervical region of the uterus is kind of the neck of the uterus. It's like the skinny part of the uterus that leads to the vagina. And that's where the baby will pass through. So I don't know this for sure, but I think that's the way that this came about. I think the name cervix comes from the word cervical, which means neck or means that skinnier region. Good question. So, questions on the vertebrae. We're not going to get into markings of the vertebrae or anything yet. Yeah, we're not going to get into any of that. We're just going to go with the names. So 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 1 sacrum, 1 coccyx. All right, thoracic rib cage. The thoracic cage consists of your thoracic vertebrae, the ribs, and the sternum. How many ribs do we have?
24.
24, good. We have 12 on the right side, 12 on the left side. How many cervical vertebrae do we have?
7.
Nope. Yeah, you're right, 7. How many thoracic vertebrae do we have? Thinking 2 different things.
Thoracic is 12.
Thoracic is 12.
12.
So for every thoracic vertebrae, you have a right and a left rib coming off of that vertebrae. Right? You have 12 pairs of ribs, 12 on the right and 12 on the left. Each pair comes off of a thoracic vertebrae. So off of T1, you have the first 2 ribs. Off of T2, you have the second 2 ribs, and so forth. So you can always remember how many ribs you have based on how many thoracic vertebrae you have. They're obviously they are there to protect your heart and your lungs. And then we have a sternum in the front, right? So here's a good picture of the rib cage. In the front, you have the sternum. So this whole bone is called the sternum. It's divided into 3 regions. The manubrium, which is this wider part at the top, the body, and the xiphoid process, which is the tip of the sternum. Now, you can kind of see T1 here is your first thoracic vertebrae, and here are your ribs coming off T1, and you can see T12. We have several different categories of ribs. We have true ribs. And if you look over here, true ribs are pairs 1 through 7. They are called true ribs because each of them connects to a thoracic vertebrae and comes all the way around and connects to the sternum. Now there is cartilage there, right? There's always a little bit of cartilage where it connects to the sternum. But true ribs, rib pairs 1 through 7, come around and connect directly to the sternum. False ribs do not, okay? So anything from rib 8, from rib pair 8 to rib pair 12, they don't actually connect to the sternum. If you look at 8, 9, and 10, which you can see better over here, 8, 9, and 10, they kind of swoop up and they connect to 7, which connects to the sternum. You can see it better in the redrawing here. 8, 9, and 10 swoop up and connect to 7, which is connected to the sternum. So you can feel those ribs down here, right? They kind of swoop up. So those are called false ribs because they don't really attach all the way from your vertebrae to your sternum. And then pairs 11 and 12 are called floating. You can see them out here. They're only attached to the thoracic vertebrae. They don't come around and attach to anything. They're just sticking out, right? There's one here and one here. They just come like halfway around and stick out. They don't attach to anything. So make sure you know which ribs are true, which are false, and which are floating.
Question.
Yeah.
Are the false ribs and floating ones, are those easier to break because they're not connected to the sternum?
The floating ones definitely are.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
You're welcome. All right. So here we go with the ribs, right? There are 12 pairs. The first 7 are true. Ribs 8 through 12, or rib pairs 8 through 12 are false ribs. 8 through 10 actually connect to 7. And then the last 2 pairs, 11 and 12, are floating. They just stick out. Right. The sternum itself, right, is 3 parts that fuse together by your mid-20s. So there's the broad triangular part at the top called the manubrium, the elongated body, and then the inferior tip is the xiphoid process. This is the one that can get broken with CPR. My first daughter, when my wife was pregnant with my first daughter, she kicked the xiphoid process out a lot. My wife, she had to have it like pushed back in several times. Not pleasant. So this is all axial skeleton. Okay, we went through the bones of the skull, the hyoid bone. We didn't talk about them, but we just mentioned there are 3 bones in each ear, right? Those are called ossicles. Those are part of the axial skeleton. The bones of the vertebrae, the vertebral column, and the bones of the ribs. What I want to do is go through the appendicular skeleton as well before we leave today. So the appendicular skeleton, that comes from the same word as appendage. So those are your arms and legs and what holds your arms and legs onto your body. A lot of these bones are bones that you've heard before. You've heard the names of them before. So the pectoral girdle. If I say pectoral, what area do you think of in the body?
Chest.
Chest. Yeah, your pectoral girdle holds your upper limbs on, right? Your arms. So your pectoral girdle are the bones that hold the upper limbs to the center of your body. They consist of the clavicle and the scapula. Both are extremely important muscle attachment sites. Think about how many different ways you can move your arm at your shoulder. It's because there are so many muscles attached to the clavicle and the scapula. What is your clavicle? What do we commonly call your clavicle?
Collarbone.
Collarbone. What is your scapula commonly called?
Shoulder blade.
Shoulder blade. Yep. So that's what's holding your arm onto your body, is your collarbone and your shoulder blade. The clavicle is an S-shaped bone. It has a sternal end and a acromion end. The sternal end meets up with the sternum, right? That's this flat end, so it's going to meet here at the sternum. The other end, the acromial end, acromial means shoulder, so it meets at the highest point of your shoulder. That's the end that's more lateral. And then you have the scapula. The scapula is a triangular bone. It has a lot of different processes on it. There are a few that I want you to know. So in the scapula, you have these two projections coming off of it, these two processes where there's a lot of muscle attachment. One is called the acromion, one is called the coracoid process. The acromion is the one that's a little bit higher. I always think of, like the Acropolis in Athens is up on a hill. It's high up. So the acromion is higher, that's your shoulder. Coracoid's a little bit further down. That's going to be a little bit further down on your body. This part in here, and if they turn the bone this way, it's called the glenoid cavity. That's where your humerus sits. That's where your upper arm sits. So that's kind of how your shoulder sits in there. And one of the reasons why the shoulder is so often dislocated is because it's all really just tendons and muscles holding your shoulder in there. If you look at this glenoid cavity, it's not very deep, right? It's not like a deep cavity. So that ball is just sitting there. The ball of your upper arm is just kind of sitting there. And it's just dependent on all of these tendons and muscles to hold it in place. If we flip the scapula over, so this is a view, this is the anterior view. So this would be if you're viewing it from the front. If you flip it over and you're looking at it from the back, there's a ridge that runs along it. It's called the spine. So those are what I want you to know. I want you to know the acromion, coracoid, the spine, and the glenoid cavity. The upper limb, right, your upper arm is called the humerus. It extends from the scapula to the elbow. And again, for this class, for the one semester class, I'm not going into any of these markings, these bone markings. If you take 2 semester A&P, you'll have to learn all these different bone markings, right? The shaft is called the diaphysis again. And this is each epiphysis that we've talked about before. The forearm is made up of 2 bones, the radius and the ulna. How do you know which one is which? Anybody have one? So the radius is always your thumb side of your forearm. Ulna is always your pinky side of your forearm. The reason I never say inside and outside is because it depends if you flip your hands palms up or palms down. When you turn your hands over, right, so anatomical position is palms up. If you flip your hands over, the forearm and the radius actually cross over each other. They kind of form an X over each other. That's why I never say inside, outside, just pinky and thumb side and the 2 sides.
Is one slightly larger than the other?
The ulna is a little bit longer. The radius is a little bit thicker.
Okay.
So we have the humerus, the radius, and the ulna. Then the wrist bones collectively are called carpals. There are individual names for the 8 carpals. You don't have to know them for this class, for the 1 semester class. Here are the names of the carpals: the scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, and hamate. And there are mnemonics to remember them. But you just have to know them collectively as carpals. A lot of times that's easy to remember because most people have heard of carpal tunnel syndrome, where you have an issue with the nerves that pass through those bones. Then your hand bones. You have 5 bones in your hand. Those are called metacarpals. They don't have individual names. They're just named metacarpal 1, metacarpal 2, 3, 4, and 5. Number 1 is the one closest to your thumb. Okay, and then you go from there, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then your fingers are called phalanges. And pretty much for each finger, you have a proximal. You have 3 phalanges in each finger: a proximal, a middle, and a distal. Right? The proximal is the closest to your wrist, then the middle, then the distal is the edge, the outermost one. Your thumb only has a proximal and a distal. There's no middle. Thumb only has 2 phalanges. Okay, so there's the 5 metacarpals. Each hand has 14 phalanges. And those are all long bones. So when we talked about the wrist, these little round bones, those are called short bones. But even though the bones in the hand and in the fingers aren't very long, they're still called long bones because they're longer than they are wide. So then that was all for the upper limbs. With the lower limbs, you have a girdle that holds your lower limbs to your body called the pelvic girdle. Right, the pectoral girdle is the upper one, and the pelvic girdle is your lower girdle. It consists of 2 irregularly shaped bones called coxal bones. Okay, so you have a right coxal and a left coxal bone. Each coxal bone is actually a fusion of 3 bones. So as we age, they fuse together: the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. So that fusion is complete by about 17. The hip bones articulate with the sacrum, just meaning that both your right and your left hip bones connect to your sacrum and at the back, right? So the sacrum was kind of the lowest part of your spine. And the femur is what attaches to your hip bones. Right, so here is a picture of your pelvic girdle. This is one hip bone or coxal bone. It is the fusion of 3 bones, right? But we count it as 1 bone. You can see the 3 different colors: the ilium purple, the ischium tan, the pubis pink. We have a right and a left coxal bone. So they're fused together. You can see at the front here, they're fused together with a piece of cartilage. That's called your pubic symphysis. And you can see here's your sacrum behind both bones. So your vertebral column would go up from the sacrum, or superior from the sacrum, right? And then your sacrum connects with both of these coxal bones.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Why do some bones fuse together and others don't? Like, why doesn't the sacrum fuse to the hip bone?
I think probably just because you need a certain amount of movement between the sacrum and the hip bone, especially like during childbirth. So I think some of the bones fuse together because strength outweighs movement, right? In some cases, so like these 3 bones are stronger as 1 bone fused together. And think about your pelvis carrying a lot of the weight of your body. Whereas you have to have some movement between, say, your hip bone and actually your back, your sacrum, in order to move your hips correctly and to move your thigh and all that sort of thing. So I think it's just a matter of whether or not the function of support and strength outweighs the function of movement
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Another silly question, just because you brought it up, childbirth.
Yeah.
I know that like when we were pregnant, our hips expand for that. Which area, like, is it between the ilium and the sacrum that expands? Is it like space?
It's between the two, the pubis of both of them. So this right here is cartilage.
Yeah. So
And
that's,
so the birth canal is here,
yeah.
right? And so this can actually allow the right and the left hip bones to expand,
Okay.
get wider.
Okay. So cool.
Isn't it amazing? It's amazing. The human body is ridiculous. When we're looking at the pelvis, you can see this indentation right here. You can see one over here. Those are the two indentations where your femur will sit. So similar to what we saw in the shoulder, right? The scapula had an indentation where your humerus sat. Each coxal bone has an indentation where the femur sits. It's a much deeper indentation. The femur is a much better fit in this bone than your humerus is in your scapula, which is why it's more common to dislocate your shoulder or your arm than it is to dislocate your hip, right? There's a lot more, not only is there more connective tissue, not only more muscle and tendons, but there's just a better fit between those two bones. All right, so again, the coxal bones or the hip bones, they are a fusion of the ilium, the ischium, and the pubic bone. And again, I'm not making you guys know the bone markings. I want you to know the names of the bones. The lower limb, bones of the thigh are called the femurs, right? And each femur articulates with the coxal bone. And then you have an actual bone for your knee called the patella. So that's a big difference between upper and lower limbs. Your elbow isn't a separate bone. So the patella is your kneecap, and the patella is only attached by tendons and ligaments. And then the bones of your lower leg, you have two of them, the tibia and the fibula. So just like you had two bones in your forearm, you have two bones in your lower leg, your tibia and your fibula. Does anybody know which one's which? No? The tibia is much bigger than the fibula. The tibia is your shin bone. It's much larger. Your fibula is always on the lateral side. It's a thinner bone. It's longer, but much thinner. Then collectively, the bones of the ankle are called the tarsals. So the wrists were carpals, the ankles are tarsals. You have bones of the foot that are called metatarsals. So we had metacarpals for hand bones, we have metatarsals for your foot, and then phalanges are your toes. Right, so here's your femur. This is the part of your femur that sits in that that spot in your coxal bone. So it sits in what's called the acetabulum. Then this is your tibia. The skinny one is your fibula. Okay. And then, well, they don't have a foot in there. Okay, and then the bones of the ankle are called, again, tarsals. The foot are metatarsals. The toes are phalanges. And the big toe only has two phalanges. The other toes all have three. Now, what we are going to do tomorrow, since we covered a lot today, is talk about joints or articulations. So the areas where you have two bones that meet are called joints or articulations. And we'll talk about those tomorrow. There are different types of joints based on how movable they are. And the other thing I want to do tomorrow is I want to look up something that we can use in Pearson and kind of use that as a lab to label bones and to look at bones. So what kind of questions do you have for me? We covered a lot today, but what kind of questions do you have?
I was wondering what the purpose is of having 2 bones in the like forearm and the calf.
It's a good question. I don't know about the lower leg. The forearm, I think it's more for movement. If we, you think about how you turn your wrist over or your hands over, those 2 bones are, if it was one bone, it would be much harder and more cumbersome to turn that over, right? Those 2 bones are connected in such a way that the distal ends cross over each other, and that allows you to flip your hand over. But your leg bones, your tibia and your fibula, are basically, it doesn't really move. The joint between them doesn't really move. So I don't know evolutionarily. That's a good question. I don't know why exactly that would be 2 bones rather than 1. Good question. Other questions? All right. So if there are no questions, I will see you guys tomorrow at 3 o'clock. And if you have any questions between now and then, just email me and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.